Welcome to this session of the Writers' Festival with Phillip Adams and Ramona Koval, who actually get paid for doing what most of us would gladly do for free, talk to interesting people. I first became aware of Phillip in the early 1970s when, as a Catholic schoolboy, I stared at the television with a mixture of shock and awe as he took on the church and the establishment and argued that God did not exist. Phillip was dressed in black from head to toe and seemed impossibly glamorous, an Antipodean version of a left bank intellectual. The only thing missing was a baguette under one arm and Juliet Greco on the other. I later learned that Phillip was a socialist and the founder of one of the country's foremost advertising agencies, our very own Don Draper. Who was this man, I wondered, a Marxist who peddled Marlborough? Of course, Phillip has spent much of his remarkable career defying definition. He was a central figure in the renaissance of the Australian film industry in the 1970s, producing such iconic movies as The Adventures of Barry Mackenzie, The Getting of Wisdom, Don's Party, Lonely Hearts, and We of the Never Never. He is the author of over 20 books, including The Unspeakable Adams, Adams vs. God, Talkback, Retreat from Tolerance, and A Billion Voices. He is a prolific newspaper columnist, contributing most frequently to The Australian, and most significantly, he is host of Late Night Live, a program that is mandatory listening for liberal-minded Australians and an anathema to all those convinced that the ABC is one of Osama bin Laden's favourite hideouts. Welcome, Phillip. Ramona Koval is a more recent passion of mine, but we spend many, many intimate hours together. I am one of Phillip's poddies, so I like nothing better than to jog along the beach while listening to Ramona as she dives into a conversation with a world-famous author or tackle an issue transfixing the literary world. Ramona's style is not confrontational, but she manages, through a mix of charm, good humour and gentle cajoling, to get even the crustiest legend to open up about their life and their work. Phillip, I generally reserve your podcast for when I'm lifting weights at the gym. I'm not sure what that means, but I have to say your chats with B. Campbell work wonders when I'm doing arm curls. Ramona has had a long and varied career on radio, but established a name in the literary world in 1994 when she joined the ABC program Books and Writing. She is now the host of The Book Show, a daily discussion about books that has become a cornerstone of literary life in this country. Such is Ramona's reputation that she is now a regular participant in several major literary festivals around the world, Edinburgh, Montreal, Cheltenham, and the conversations she records at these events are highlights of The Book Show. Ramona is also the author of several books, including the novel Samovar and a cookbook, Jewish Cooking and Jewish Cooks. Her latest collection of radio national interviews is called Speaking Volumes, Conversations with Remarkable Writers. Welcome, Ramona. Okay, during the 1960s, the French literary theorist Roland Barthes gleefully announced the death of the author. God has been long buried, thanks to Phillip and his kind. So now it was time to cremate the author. What a writer has to say about his or her work is of no interest. According to the post-structuralist, the work should speak for itself. Now, Ramona, you probably talk to more literary figures than you actually have spoken to ordinary folk. Are those conversations that you have with these figures, are they purely about gossip and celebrity and glamour, or do they actually yield something about the work itself?
Oh, well, I'm not interested in gossip and celebrity and glamour. And, you know, those post-structuralists, nobody ever knows who they are anymore. You know, what happened to them, really? They're the ones who are dead.
Well, they're teaching at universities across the country, aren't they, Ramona?
As I said, they're the ones who are dead. No, it was a poor joke and poor taste. But look, there's nothing more wonderful than holding somebody's work in your hands, reading it closely, and there's nothing more intimate than getting inside the head of somebody who has told you what they've thought about, what matters to them, what's moved them, and I think that's the most important thing about the sort of work that I do.
And do they elucidate the work at hand? Do you feel as though after a conversation with one of these authors, you know their work better?
Maybe they know their work better.
Okay.
Because it's very different. You writing something and then somebody else coming to you and saying to you what it made them think, what it made them feel, what connections it made for them. That can be very enriching for people. It's a two-way street, I think.
So you see it as a conversation as opposed to an interview.
Well, what is an interview? I'm not the KGB.
Yeah, not interrogating them.
So it's not that kind of interview. I regard it as a great privilege to have a conversation, to share ideas and to share it with the listeners and to point listeners towards something that they might be interested in, to read, to examine more thoroughly, to have a look at all the other books that this person has written. And so for me it's a great chance to enrich the cultural life of the country, to share in the views of people who are listening. We've got this fantastic resource now, the ABC online site, where people can write in and say what they think of somebody's work. They can disagree with a review. This is the marvellous thing about where we work. I mean, Radio National, the place where the whole country can have the conversation it needs to have. And I just see my little chink in the wall of Radio National is for sharing those kinds of conversations.
Now, Phillip, literary authors are only a small part of what you do. You range across all the fields of study of history, of politics, intellectual life. But I sort of suspect that literary authors, have a special place in your heart.
It's interesting, listening to the conversation you two are having, and incidentally, one thing left out of the generous introduction. We love this woman so much at Radio National that the ABC elected her to be a board member. And that was a role that John Howard got rid of, and we hope to see it come back.
I broke it.
I tend to interview authors who are not fiction writers. I find fiction terribly difficult to deal with on radio, and it requires degrees of subtlety that we really don't have time for when we're doing 3 stories a night. So we live on ideas, the books of ideas, and my authors tend to be, I think, less complex, or rather, that's not what it's about. It's about what they're writing about, not about them.
Yes.
There are some differences. Some of my most admired non-fiction guests are bastards. That's right. I wanted to mention Patrick White. The trouble with finding too much out about an author is you won't necessarily like it. I hold the novels of Patrick White in the highest regard. And I have to tell you, Patrick was one of the most detestable people I've ever met. Did you ever interview him?
I didn't interview Patrick White, but I think this is a big mistake to ever think that the writer that you're going to meet is going to be your best friend or someone you'll like. I mean, it's not the case that somebody who's been gifted in explaining some aspect of life in their own very special way knows how to actually sit down at a table and share a conversation with you or be pleasant for an hour. I mean, it's a mistake to expect it.
Has that ever put you off an author? Have you then said, I really don't want to read that book, or looked at a book in a different light after a not so pleasant encounter with an author?
The only people who I think it applies to, for me, are travel writers. Because, when someone's a travel writer, they've gone to a place and they are your emissary, and they are telling you what it's like over there. This is what the people are like, this is what the landscape's like, this is what my experience has been. What have I dropped? So I found that if you meet a travel writer and they're a real bastard, you think, gee, this is what they're probably like everywhere they go. And this is why...
All my writers are travel writers, in the sense that they take me and the listener to a destination.
But if they don't actually have the human values or the human kind of touch to insert themselves into the place that they're telling you about and have an experience that they will convey to you, I mean, you don't necessarily want to know about a place which is what it's like when you're a real bastard and you go there. And that's the sort of, that's a couple of people that I've interviewed, and I've thought to myself, I don't think I'll be talking to them again because actually I don't trust their view of things.
Phillip, I'll just take you back to literature. Do you think that, I seem to remember, even in your early years, you actually attempted to be a novelist, didn't you, in your young creative days?
Not really. There's 3 or 4 appalling documents that I think I've either shredded or burnt. No, I could never do it. I also tried drama, but I have a tin ear for dialogue. Whatever you say about David Williamson, people say very nasty things about David. He's got an extraordinarily good ear for idiom. I don't have that. So I've in fact, I've published millions of words, but almost none of them have been fictional. I may do an autobiography, and that, of course, would be fictional. But
but do you think that writers? You're dealing with people with ideas on the world.
Well, one hopes they've got ideas. Yes.
Ideas in the world.
Some of them are simply academics who publish tautologies.
Do you think that literary writers have a particular view that's worth interrogating? Is there a view
Let's look at the hierarchy of writers.
Yeah.
Right at the top of the tree, there's the Dead Poets Society, and I'm not talking so much about, say, Tennyson, who charged off into the Valley of Death, but, say, Sylvia Plath. Les Murray is wandering around the place. Now, there's no question, most people absolutely defer to the poets as the highest form of literature. That may be right. I don't know that it's right because I can never work poetry out. The next realm are certainly the fiction writers. The fiction writers, we want to believe in them as human beings. There's a need to, very often, which is what Writers' Weeks and festivals are often about. It's a chance to come close to them and really try to know them and I think to like them. My sort of writers, people really aren't interested in their psyche. My thesis is very simple, that writing is a very, very simple impulse. The first thing that humans do in a cave in Altamira, in the Drakensbergs, up in the Kimberleys, is they put their hand on the cave wall and they make an imprint of their hand with spittle. I was here. That's the first impulse of the writer. The second, I think, is therapy. I think most people who write because they have a degree of psychological damage. Not you, Ramona.
I have a degree of psychological damage.
And I started writing for that reason. I wrote to stay sane when I was dealing with a psychotic and often murderous stepfather. And most of the writers I know, the fiction writers, start off in that way, as do comedians. They're people that are trying to give themselves some sort of, not camouflage, some sort of protection from a world that can be pretty tough. My sort of writers are purely intellectually driven, and often their work isn't that emotional. But basically, we want to believe, and writers are the oldest celebrities. You think about it. It took 2 days for the people of Paris to pass by Victor Hugo's window at the time of his death. He was, I'm told, the most famous man on earth. Dickens wouldn't have been far behind him. Byron, for God's sake. And then more recently, the first sort of hyper-celebrity in Oscar Wilde, Samuel Clemens. So we've wanted to exalt and celebrate our writers.
But are you as interested in the views on, say, the Iraq War as, say, Harold Pinter as Tariq Ali, for instance?
Now, that's just the point I'm going to make. When her writers move into my territory, they bring with them a special gravitas. Any Australian writer who moves from fiction into a political essay, that essay tends to get an immense amount of interest if it's a David Malouf or someone else, writing a quarterly essay.
But do you think that's correct, though? Do you think it should?
I think it is good.
Why?
Because your writers work on a different deadline than my writers. I've been churning out 2 or 3 columns a week for 40, 50 years. So there's not a lot of cogitation, there's not a lot of study, you just do it. Your writers can spend a week on a paragraph, and do.
But they may not know that much about the Iraq War.
Yeah. I think their cognitive processes of a fine writer like a Malouf who's wrote one of the most wonderful pieces of prose I've ever read about a bloke on a beehive, I think is pretty good at looking at a beehive like Iraq. It's the same when, say, Einstein moves from pure science to philosophising. We take him terribly seriously. So when you live in two worlds, I mean...
And can writers humanise the situation? Your wonderful interview with Harold Pinter, he describes the death of a child and a child in the arms of a mother in Sarajevo, and it's deeply moving just within the interview itself. I'm not quite sure whether Tariq could do that.
He has the words. He chooses the words. He knows how to deliver them. He has the command of silence.
Exactly. Yes. Now, to more practical matters, Ramona, how do you prepare for an interview with an author? Is that do you read everything you can? Do you reach back?
Yeah.
Do you have time to do that?
Yes.
And the first question that you ask, is it crucial? Do you have to think about that first question to set the tone?
Yeah, I always do. I mean, I read everything. I read the book that I'm supposed to be talking about, but I also try. But I do.
Most authors don't expect that. Most authors, when they're being interviewed, assume that the interrogator hasn't read the book.
Well, that's right. That's why. But why would I not? I mean, for me, the fun is learning something new and engaging with things, and that's that's the fun part. So I would read that. I would read essays that they've written. I would read previous books But now I've been doing this for quite a while now. It turns out I have read previous
them all already,
books,
yes, indeed.
because I've often talked to them before. I read the reviews after I've finished a book, so I can see whether I agree with them.
Yeah.
I read other interviews. I look at YouTube now and see what they're like, whether what their delivery is like. And the first question is absolutely vital because, I mean, especially in a sort of a live situation like this, you have to sort of work out. I don't work it out necessarily in advance. I might have a couple of possibilities. It's just that if I meet the person a few minutes before, and then I can work out whether that's a good approach or I need to do something else. And I think it is important because as soon as you ask a question, you can either open your arms and say, come here for this conversation, or you go, you don't want to put them back in their seats.
And have you ever had a bad first question that you regret asking that question, that you've already set the interview down one path that you didn't want to go?
No, I haven't. I think I've been pretty seriously thinking about how to do it for a while.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's like anything. I sort of imagine you inviting people into your home, you're into your room, and you're saying, come and sit down here, let's talk. I'll make you comfortable, and let's now have this conversation. I mean, it's sort of the normal sort of hospitality that one learns, and that's really how I imagine, that's how I prepare.
And Phillip, you get through a vast amount of material on a weekly basis. Do you use researchers extensively? Do you have a young crew that help you out?
I've got wonderful producers, and I fast read before I go to air. And then I bring the book. If I like the interview, I then read the book thoroughly afterwards. So it's a different sequence. To me, it's not so much the first question. It's often the introduction.
Yeah.
May I be permitted to tell my favourite intro story, which I don't think I've ever told publicly? We landed Henry Kissinger, and he was going to come into the 30 Rock studios the ABC has in New York, and I was astonished we had him. I detested Henry Kissinger. It comes to mind because last night in the hotel there's a wonderful 2-hour interview with Kissinger, quite tough, on National Geographic Channel of all things. Anyway, we land him, and the book is Diplomacy. And I actually did read it, and it was a masterwork. Apart from the self-serving chapters on Cambodia, it was an overarching history of diplomacy, and it was riveting. So he comes in, and he's late into the studio. Now, at the time, David Hill was running the ABC. David Hill fantasised that he was going to be the next Secretary-General of the United Nations, as did Bob Hawke, as did Gareth Evans. So we had 3 egomaniacal Australians all convinced that they should get this job. Of them, I suppose Gareth was the best qualified, but basically, and as I remember reminding a couple of them, no one with English as a first language ever got the job. And Bob Hawke couldn't possibly get the job because he was so wildly pro-Israel that there'd be block votes against him. Anyway, David Hill flies to New York to welcome Kissinger.
To your studio?
To actually welcome Kissinger into the studio for the interview. Now, David and I were not on speaking terms. I used to write terrible columns about him, and how he had to go. And so I'm prolonging another interview, keeping it going, because I want to hear that the eagle has landed. So only half my attention's on these poor guys who've written a masterwork on 30 years of research, because I'm actually listening. Here's Kissinger turned up. Well, I hear him thumping into the studio, and he's in a foul mood, really grumpy. I think, oh, Christ, this is going to be heaven. So finally he sits down, and I said, you know, it's a wonderful thing about America. Log cabin to White House. You can start in the Okefenokee swamps and you can finish up as the president. Unfortunately, you can't, the log house can't be on the blistered plains of Poland. You know, they've got to be somewhere in America. Otherwise, my next guest would have got to the White House under his own steam, in his own right. And I heard Kissinger emit a sound that was very close to the orgasm. And then I had him, say, and the interview went well, but there was an aftermath. As he left the studio, I could still hear him, and he said to David Hill, "What a wonderful interview. That's the best interview I've ever had." And David said, "Oh, he's a very close personal friend of mine." And then Kissinger came to Sydney and took me to lunch. Now, the point being, I think the intro also settles. Now, that's a shameful case of flattery, but normally you try to make them comfortable before the first question, don't you?
Yes, that's true. And I don't interview people whose work I don't like, so that makes me totally passionate, really. I mean, I really mean
You're their advocate as much as their interviewer.
Yeah, because who's got time to read bad books? I haven't. You haven't.
Yeah, but I do, occupationally. But there's another paradox. An author of a rotten book can give a dazzling interview.
Oh, yes. We call it good
vice
talent.
bloody versa. You know,
Yes.
there can be a book that you worship, and then the author comes on in a stumbled tongue or cold or humourless. And
That's right. So we are actually making conversations. We are actually making radio, and it has to be something you want to listen to. It has to be a person who can take you through the ideas and keep you on the edge of your seat and engage you. And for some people, they just are not ever going to be like that.
let's go back
They're
to
not going to appear at writers' festivals, and they're not going to probably appear on the radio. But they can be fantastic writers, and you should be reading their books. Sorry.
No, you just reminded
me.
me of the crossovers. The idea of author as celebrity. I've had Gore Vidal on the program on many occasions. Now, Vidal, of course, fiction writer, writes some pretty good novels. And
Much better essayist.
I would have thought so. So I get Vidal on. Now, people congratulate you on what a great interview you did with Gore Vidal. No, you didn't. Gore Vidal interviews himself. Yes. So you introduce him. You can then walk out of the studio, go around the block, have a cup of coffee, have a smoke in the stairwell, come back and thank him for his appearance. Because it's a performance piece, and that is true of many of the most celebrated authors. I like an author who comes on and there's a long half second while they think of an answer, and it's magic. Because most people on radio are glib, they're used to the media, they're familiar with it, but it's when you ask a question and you don't get an immediate answer, but a heartbeat.
That is very rewarding.
It's a special, special thing, and it happens very rarely.
Because you know that they're thinking on their feet, and you want them to think on their feet, and you want it to be an interesting experience for them, and you want to forget everything, but you just explore these ideas together. And that is the most exciting part.
Ramona, have you ever had an interview that's just gone so completely off the rails that you've never actually broadcast it? You just actually...
I had an interview that went
question.
completely off the rails, and I broadcast it.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if you heard my interview with Bret Easton Ellis that I recorded at the Byron Bay Writers' Festival last year, where Bret Easton Ellis, Wunderkind...
What a wonderfully Jewish gesture.
Basically, it was interesting because I hadn't read American Psycho when it came out, because I really thought, do I really need to read this book about dismembering and cannibalism and stuff like that? And it was in a plastic wrapper and everything, and it was before I was doing literary shows. I was doing other kinds of work. So I didn't. But then, for this, I read American Psycho on the way up in the plane, and I had read his new book, and I had read something else. And the week before, I'd had a conversation with him. He'd rung... I had to ring him at 10 to 2. I had 10 to 2 to 2 o'clock to talk to him. So I rang him and said, I'm Ramona, blah, 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 we're going to have this conversation. What would you like to do? And he said, anything you want. And he said, what would you like to do? And I said, well, it's a literary festival. Look, I've read your work. I have this radio show. I'll be recording it. Why don't we talk about your work? Talk about your books, talk about blah, 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 all the ideas. And the festival audience will be interested in that because they're there. It's a literary festival. If that is okay with you, absolutely fine, he said. And then he said something like, sometimes I might go off script, but, you can bring me back and it'll be fine, and that's great, we'll do what you want. So, okay, fine. The night comes, he arrives at 1 minute to 7 for a 7 o'clock start, so there's no sort of chance beforehand to say anything, but we arrive on the stage, and then I ask him, and do an introduction, ask him the first question, and then he says something like, Delta Goodrem is hot. And, really? And he said, I've been watching Australian video clips in my hotel room, and she is hot. But, the video clips are so 80s. It's so 80s, but she's hot. And I sort of thought...
You're hot, right, Ramona. You're gorgeous.
Thank you. Yeah. And I said, well, and this has got to do with what? And he went, I'm just saying Delta Goodrem is hot. And I think, well, did you want to, I can't even remember what I said anymore, but, tried to make it clear, did you want to have this conversation, or is this a stand-up, or shall I just sit over here until you're ready to have this conversation? So I behaved like, what I am, which is a Jewish grandmother. And I thought, I've met naughty boys before. I'm not going to be railroaded like this. So what it was this... very kind of slightly embarrassing for the audience, I think. But, anyway, it was a bit of a shtick for him.
And you were thinking American Psycho.
I was thinking American Psycho. But anyway, I thought, well, this is okay. I'm going to play this because people need to know what he's like. I thought he was very shallow. And I thought he was probably the result of being shot to fame after writing, something shocking at the time, and being the responsibility of the manufacturing business of stardom and gossip and all of that. And so, we played it, and, people said, God, Ramona, you haven't got a sense of humour, or God, I'm glad you played that, or wasn't he a prat? Or, all of that. And for the funniest things was 2 little girls came up at the end. They were 17. And one said, I thought he was awful. I'm going to tell my mother. So, yes, I have had things go off the rails, but I wouldn't censor it just because it went off the rails.
So Ramona really interviews people whose work you adore. Phillip, do you go out of your way? You're known as the guy that's got this kind of little left-wing radio show at night, but you do actually take oppositional voices, don't you?
Oh, for heaven's sake, yes. Very often the people one agrees with are dead boring, whereas the people one doesn't agree with are more interesting. But then you get interesting complexities. I'm often, as one of the better-known atheists in Australia, I'm equated with, bracketed with Hitchens. And with Dawkins. Incidentally, Hitchens was on, I think, my first ever program. And he was wrong about the Iraq War then, and he was wrong about the Second Iraq War. But anyway, so notionally, Dawkins and I agree. But I find him so disagreeable as a person that I would rather poke my eye with a fork than ever have him on the program again. I've got another problem, which I just know how Ramona feels about this. I talked about interviewing someone I detested in Kissinger. It's often a greater problem to interview someone for whom you have an absolute unlimited admiration. And the most poignant example to me was Arthur Miller. To me, one of the greatest nights of my life was when I was 15 or 16. I went along and saw Death of a Salesman at the Union Theatre in Melbourne. And I can see it now in my mind as though I was there. And it was the most astonishing experience to think that someone like my uncle Eddie, who was a salesman, could be a tragic figure. He democratised tragedy, if you say. And I loved his essays. He did essays on Nuremberg. He did wonderful writing. Yeah. And so when we landed him, and the producer said, what are you going to ask him about Marilyn? I said, I'm not going to mention Marilyn Monroe. I'm not a voyeur. I don't want to discuss that. I want to discuss his ideas. So he settles down and he describes the opening night of Death of a Salesman in New York. And it's a wonderful story because as the curtain goes down, there's a silence and the audience did not clap. There wasn't any response for 5 minutes. Then they started to clap. And they've been clapping ever since. So Arthur loves telling that story. And then we meander here and there. And bugger me dead, he keeps bringing out Marilyn Monroe. He said, my wife, Marilyn Monroe, and he must have done it 10 times. No matter what the question was, he came back with this poignant reference to Marilyn. And I thought, the vulnerability of this bloke, he was dead within a few weeks, that he was still haunted by the ghost of Marilyn Monroe. I found that unutterably sad, but I had the same experience with John Kenneth Galbraith, and I interviewed him in his house. And he's a dear old thing, and he is, to the end of his life, he was obsessed with Jackie. And after the interview, he took me around the house with a torch and shined the torchlight on photographs of he and Jackie, of which there were thousands. What his wife felt about that, I have no idea.
Ramona, Phillip mentioning one of arguably your great literary hero, Arthur Miller, but you said it was a great interview, though. You were saying it was disappointing for you?
Oh, no. I was mortified for him. I wanted to protect him.
Yes.
Did you know what? I was a Jewish mother.
And it ended beautifully. I re-listened to it yesterday. It said, I'm too tired to talk now.
Yeah, well...
I thought that was lovely. Ramona, what about your great heroes? are there certain living authors that are giants for you that you've been able to interview and you've been slightly disappointed with?
I have to have a hero, I have to interview them and be slightly disappointed.
No, okay. Or have their... Sorry. Well, okay, which author is the one that's given you the most trepidation and most anticipation?
I was trepidatious about interviewing Gore Vidal, and I interviewed him in Edinburgh. And he arrived... I was trepidatious because he's so brilliant, he's so acerbic, he can be so vicious and clever. And I didn't think he'd like me. And he arrived, I was told, it was an 11 o'clock in the morning interview on a cold Edinburgh day, which they thought called summer. And I'd heard from the woman who ran the festival, they arrived, he and Howard, his partner, arrived from Italy at 3 a.m, to Edinburgh, and they were so pissed that they had to be taken off the plane in wheelchairs. They'd been drinking Bombay gin all the way from Ravello or somewhere, and then it was at 11 o'clock in the morning, and I thought, oh, how is he going to be with a sore head as well? So I was a bit nervous, and something had just come out in Vanity Fair, a big article that morning, and I thought, oh God, I'm not going to have to read something else, because I'd read a lot, and I read this thing about Vanity Fair. It was all about the bomber, the Oklahoma bomber. And I thought I'll just take that in with me, and I made a few notes. And anyway, I met him, and he was just magnificent. He's such a handsome man, and he was quite old, but terribly handsome, and done up in this suit. He looked fantastic, and he walked very, very slowly. But he sat down in front of this huge audience of maybe 1,000 people, and he was marvellous. His brain worked incredibly well, until one point where he said he wanted to quote something, and he said, I don't know if I've got this right. And I just went, oh, I think it could be this. And I thought, oh, he's going to either go, what are you doing? But he took it and he went, why don't you follow me around all the time? Because it was just that piece from that article I'd written and I'd taken in with me. It was just absolutely lucky. But when he realised that I was kind of on his wavelength, He was marvellous. He was really
Oh,
fantastic.
look, I'm not critical of him. I mean, he's a great show. You know, he's a fantastic performer. But the ultra famous writers like him who live on talk shows, and Vidal, of course, was a pioneer talk show guest. He knows how to do it.
Yes. But, you know, I interviewed Joseph Heller at his place in New York, and he was lovely. He made me afternoon tea.
One of my heroes.
He was a hero. He would be a hero. That, you know, Catch-22 was a fantastic book that I read as a young woman. And he was marvellous. He was reading E.O. Wilson at the time. He was still engaged. He'd been very sick. But he was better. He was sort of getting better, except he died the next year, so he can't have been that
Are there any
good.
authors that you may have missed in your time as a journalist that have passed on that you would have loved to have interviewed?
Probably thousands,
Most
millions.
of my authors die after I interview them.
Someone like Philip Roth, for instance, a hero
I would
of
love
mine
to
is-
interview Philip Roth, but I don't think he's going to be interviewed. Have you interviewed Philip Roth?
No.
He does give interviews, though, because I see him being interviewed all the time in America.
And in the press.
He said no lots of times to us.
John Updike, didn't get to...
I didn't interview John Updike, but I recorded a talk he gave in a bookshop and played that. But, you know, there's some marvellous people that I haven't interviewed.
I get them just before they die, or literally they die within a week of me doing them. Arthur C. Clarke, Arthur Miller and Arthur Schlesinger. I killed all them off.
All the Arthurs gone.
And I also killed off Kurt Vonnegut, who was one of my heroes.
Yes.
Wonderful interviewer.
Who's the guy who wrote Fahrenheit 451?
Sorry?
Bradbury?
Ray Bradbury. I
Bradbury.
did the most ridiculous interview with Ray Bradbury.
He was a hero of mine when I was a kid.
Okay, well, Ray Bradbury, just like about a year and a half ago, came out in support of his local library because they were going to close the library or do something. And, of course, the man who's written a book about saving books...
Fahrenheit 451.
Exactly. And I thought, oh, he'll be great. And so and my producer actually did something which we never do. She said, oh, look, I've suggested a couple of things that we might talk to him. It was only a news story. It wasn't about a book. So it was about, you know, things that you'd be, you know, to tell us about your stand at the local library. You know, why do you think it's important? What do you think has happened? Or, you know, just some simple things. And she sent him a note to say, this is the sort of thing we'll talk about. And then we rang him. And I did the introduction. He said, OK, now, you will introduce me, and then I will ask the questions, and then I will answer them. And I said, oh, no, you mean I will ask the questions? And he went, no, you will introduce me, I will ask the questions, and then I will answer them. And I said, oh, no, Mr. Bradbury, like, I'm going to ask the questions, because I'm the journalist, you're the writer, so I'll ask the questions. I just thought he'd just, you know, how people just misspeak, as they say in America. And then he just went, Mr. Bradbury, what do you think about books? Well, he said, well, I'm glad you asked me that. And then he gave this answer, and then he said, Mr. Bradbury, and what do you think about the internet? Burn the internet, he said. Burn it, burn it, burn the internet. The man who didn't want to burn books, he was going to burn the internet. And it just goes on like this, and it was just the whole thing. And, you know, we couldn't use it like it was. So what we did was, you know, my producer made a little essay, you know, Ray Bradbury, writer of blah, 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 has taken the stance. So what does he think about libraries? And then da-da-da, and then the other. So we kind of used it, but it was the most probably silliest thing I've ever done.
I once interviewed a very famous English performer, and she sat in the studio for half an hour and refused to answer any question. There was not a word past her lips for half an hour, and then she flounced out.
What did you do? What did you do?
Well, the audience thought it was great because I was, to say the least, struggling.
Who was it?
No, I'm not going to say that.
No,
the reason being
he's not at liberty to say.
OK, I mean, she was the star of Evita on the West End. Her name was Julie Covington. And Julie was also in The Adventures of Barry Mackenzie as a young performer. So I knew her. And she came to the studio. And, you know, she came, and she was opening in Evita the next day, And so the essence of the story is she didn't open an Evita the next day. She walked off the stage and flew back to London.
So she was having trouble.
But I'll never forget it. She sat there and I'd ask her a question and she would study the studio clock. I'd ask her another and she would examine with minute detail a bit of chewing gum pressed into the carpet. And it went on for half an hour. It was the longest half hour of my life.
Why did it go on for so long, though?
Well, I had no alternative. There was
no
one
else.
other
guest.
No other guest. I didn't have a standby tape.
That's the thing. You always have to have a standby tape, don't you?
Yes, well, you do. Although, God,
just before we move on, we'll take some questions. I'll ask one more question about Christopher Hitchens. We were talking earlier about the antagonistic interview or somebody with an opposite set of opinions. You've obviously been stimulated by that relationship with Christopher Hitchens. You obviously disagree with him, but is it the...
Oh, no, we agree passionately on Kissinger. He's the one that calling for Kissinger to be arrested at any airport as a war criminal. Tick. He wrote a scandalous book on Mother Teresa. Wonderful. Tick.
Yeah.
He writes wonderfully on Orwell, Thomas Paine. Tick, 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 tick. He's a terrific literary critic. One of the greatest essays I've ever read was his review of Anthony Poll's books. I mean, I would have died to have written it. He just gets wars wrong. He, in fact, endorsed the Falklands for Margaret Thatcher, and he was a regular on the program. We can pick him. We pick these youngsters, and then they come on to do great and amazing things. So, Christopher, I'm deeply fond of him, but I just wanted to waterboard him during the Iraq War. Someone else did later, fortunately.
Phillip Adams waterboarding Christopher Hitchens on radio, I want to tune into that one. Well, any questions?
If you had to choose your number one favourite living author, who would it be now for both of you? Number one living.
Living author?
Please don't mention him. He might be dead tomorrow.
Look, it's a real problem for me. I believe there should be a moratorium declared preventing any new books being written for about 5 years so I can catch up with rereading the books I love from the past. And my favourite novel of all time is a thing called The Lost Steps by a fellow called Carpentier, who was a Cuban diplomat. I still love, and I know he's dead, The Leopard, Lampedusa. And there's a whole list of books like that, but I don't think I could name a living author with confidence. Can you?
No, I can't, because, I mean, every new book is my favourite book that I'm grappling with at the moment, and then I talk about it, and then I have to leave it aside, and then I have to open my mind for the next one. That's really the only way I can do it. So I don't really have sort of favourites. Isn't that terrible? But everyone asks that, but
authors
I don't.
live forever. It is the only sort of immortality worth two bob. To me, these people are still alive. Patrick White's still alive, the old bugger, you know. But
that's right.
So it's a distinction that's very hard to make.
I mean, it's sort of like people say, well, what should I read? Tell me what to read. But it really depends on what you love and what you're interested in and what speaks to you. And in a sense, I can only show you what there is, and you have to choose it for yourself.
You mentioned earlier on, Phillip, that in your interview with Gore Vidal, he had performed as opposed to made a conversation. Is there anything that you do as an interviewer to cut through the performance and try and get to the person behind it, or do you simply let them perform?
Sorry, hearing, can you paraphrase it for me?
You mentioned Gore Vidal as a performer. He put on a performance. Is there anything that you can do as an interviewer to cut through that performance, to break up the performance and allow the conversation to emerge?
Well, with someone like Gore Vidal, you'd be silly to try. You know, you let it happen. But if an author... Look, there are strange things that go on in the studio to which you are not witnesses. You know, interviews are in a sense structured in the head or even on paper before you start. You know, you've got a rough idea of the architecture of the interview. But often you'll ask question 1 and the subject will answer question 7, 8 and 9. You know, so the flow of it, your anticipated sequence is blown to smithereens. The real trick of interviewing is listening, isn't it?
Yes.
To intensely listen to what they're saying or trying to say. And often you've got to help them say it. So sometimes you intervene for them to get them back on the rails that they've slipped off. You'll see that, I'm sure, here, particularly with younger writers who haven't had a lot of experience. Imagine what it's like to sit out in front of a whole mob of people. It is terrifying. So this is where a good chairman, session chairman, has got to help, and we've got to help as session chairman.
Exactly. Have we another question here? Yes.
I think I've got the mic.
You do.
Ramona, I really like when I listen to you on the radio that you really, well, I'm not surprised to hear that you research your authors and you understand them. Can you give me a bit of a sense? You obviously read the book that you're going to review, and then you said, oh, and I read some essays, and I go here and I look at that. So, I mean, do you just do a general Google search, or what is it that you're looking for to understand these authors before you do the interviews?
Once I've read the book, I'll read the reviews, but then I might just Google search their name and see if they've given any interviews, or I might put their name plus interview, or their name plus essay. And I'm looking, I don't want to ask the same questions that they've been asked before. I don't want to bore them. I want to get them interested and engage them. And so I try and find an approach or a different angle. I mean, there are some things that you will have to ask that most people might have to ask, like if you've got an author who's used their own name as the name of the character. Well, obviously there's something to be asked there, but you don't start with that necessarily. I mean, you might start with something completely different, and then that will come in later on. And as Phillip says, absolutely, it's you should see us. There's the desk in front of us. There's all of these pages, and then you have this sort of game plan. If I'll say this, I'll ask that. They should say that. Then I'll ask that. Then I'll ask that. Over here and over here and over here. And as soon as they start going to number 35, you've got to go, in your head or cross that out. Where am I going to? You have to be elastic. You have to be an elastic thinker. Because it has to.
But that's the fun of it too, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
It's unpredictable for us. And it should be unpredictable for the author.
That's right. And it should be, and it shouldn't be too difficult for the audience, because you always have to think that you can't ask that question over there because you thought that they would have already known all of this stuff before you ask that. So you're going to have to give a little bit of that before you ask this question. You're going to have to summarise that, but you're not, it's just, it's good fun.
Who wrote Flaubert's Parrot?
Julian Barnes.
Okay. The only time I've ever had a killer question was with Julian Barnes, and it was at a radio station that shall remain nameless called 2UE, where I worked with people I never mentioned, like John Laws, Alan Jones and Stan Zemanek, and Julian Barnes walked in. It was a late night show. Management didn't give a damn what I was doing as long as enough people listened, and Julian Barnes sat opposite. And I said, "Why do you write?" And there's this terrible silence. And he said, "No one's ever asked me that." And then there's another silence, and he said, "Because I'm afraid of death." And it was a miracle exchange. It was one of those things that just magic, because clearly he was absolutely gobsmacked by the naivety and stupidity of the question. But out of it came that confession. And I forgot to mention that in my list of why people write. One of them is the hand on the cave wall. I am here. Another is to try and defy death for as long as you possibly can. Mortality is a character in almost every piece of writing.
Yes.
I'd just like to just put this forward. You always do post stuff, like after a book's written, Ramona, you'll do the post. Is that right?
I do the post after a book's written.
Yes.
I never talk to people before they've written the book.
No, that's right.
That's true.
And Phillip usually plugs into the ideas after they've been published and so on.
So what would you rather?
Well, no, I've never written a book, or I've never had an idea.
Are you available next Tuesday?
And I was just wondering if you do any pre-stuff, because I'd like to apply.
You have a natural gift. I think there'll be a lot of bookings for you.
while we're moving here...
Get that fellow's name and address.
Pass it over there.
Oh, dear.
This is for Philip, because Ramona, you already answered this question. Is there anyone that you have wanted to have in your radio show that has said no, and you've asked again and they've continued to say no?
Is there anyone you've wanted to have on your show that they've said no, they've refused, and continue
John
to refuse
Howard. Repeatedly, permanently, and I hope forever. The only bloke I've tried to land and have totally failed, because I admire him enormously, although for heaven's sake he's a Catholic intellectual, is Gary Wills, who writes the most remarkable book, second only to Vidal, on US politics, but also writes wonderful essays for the New York Review. If anyone's a Renaissance person on this planet at the moment, I think it's Gary Wills. But I've never got him on. But I saw him the other night doing a John Stewart thing, and I can see why. Despite the vastness of the intellect, he is so excruciatingly shy, that obviously it's a torment.
Why would he
for
go
him.
on Jon Stewart's show?
Well,
I mean, that's insane.
John does all the talking.
Yeah, but, it's very hard to be with a comedian, don't you think?
Yeah. But he's the
Especially
one I'd like
if he's
to
shy. God, is he a masochist and shy?
And he's a major academic in Chicago, but he doesn't do interviews. Wish he did.
He also wrote a book on John Wayne, I think, as well.
He wrote an essay on John Wayne, which was so homoerotic as to be embarrassing. But he also wrote a devastating explanation of the Catholic Church and its problems with pedophiles, which I think was the definitive statement.
Hello, Ramona and Phillip. A question for both of you, really. Is reading for leisure different to reading for work?
Is reading for leisure different than reading for work, Phillip and Ramona?
Do you want me to answer first?
Yeah,
I've got an
you go.
answer
I don't
for
want
this.
to think about that.
I've thought about this.
Think.
Well, I can't read anything that doesn't translate into minutes on the radio during the year at all. So there's no reading for leisure at all. Over the first few years of doing the daily show, the daily book show, I thought at the end of the year I would read dead people because I couldn't interview them. So I did that for a few years, and that was good because I had to get a bit of a literary education, historical education, because I was trained in science originally, so I didn't have any of this stuff that I needed. So I would read the Greeks and the Romans and all the stuff that I should have. But then I suddenly started to think, I could actually get an expert on, Suetonius, his 12 Caesars, and get them on, and I could get Herodotus expert on. I thought, this is me actually working on the holidays. So last summer I decided to learn French, go back to the French classes I had at school. So I had the French teacher come over the summer every afternoon for an hour and a half, and it was so much fun that every Friday at the end of the show she comes to the ABC and we have an hour and a half of French, and probably until I can read a book, a novel in French, I'll continue that. But if I can read a novel in French, I know I'll start to work again. So then I'm going to switch to Russian.
Okay, I've thought of an answer, and it's true. I drive immense distances every week from the farm to Sydney and back. And so what I do is I listen to recorded novels. I found that if I listened to music, I used to drive faster and faster and was in constant danger of hitting a tree. So I listen to recorded books. Some of them are things I've never got round to reading, like Kenneth Branagh doing the Pepys Diaries, which I'd never read. Wonderful things. I might read The Prince or have it read to me by Machiavelli, which I'd never read. I also can get away with reading books or having them read to me in the car without anyone knowing. Things I couldn't be seen dead reading if I was in a coffee shop. So I listen to John le Carré, who's a great reader of his own writing. But sometimes there are magic books. I remember I got an audio book of Lauren Bacall reading Dorothy Parker. And it's better because, it's that husky, cigarette, whiskey voice. Yeah. Who better to read to read Dorothy. So I think the audio book is a forgotten or underestimated art form, and it can be an art form.
Isn't it a pleasure to read a book that you don't have to tell anyone about?
Oh yes, absolutely.
And you don't have to make notes all the way through?
I would never publicly confess to reading John le Carré, for example. Oh. No, it's good. I go back to reading the golden oldies. I read William books quite often.
Philip, I thought you were going to say Bridget Jones's Diary or the Da Vinci Code, not John le Carré.
No, nothing like
I
that.
do read my grandchildren stories. We've just finished the Faraway Tree, the Faraway Tree with my 4.5-year-old one. And I must say, I remember that as being such a fantastic book when I was a kid, and it's a little bit ho-hum now, but she was really good. She stayed till the end because it was a big book full of writing, hardly any pictures. But I do get very sort of scratchy about bad children's books. They know now that you can't give Bubba a book that's Yiddish for grandmother, that she's not going to like if it rhymes, it has to be good poetry, and it's got to be a good story, otherwise they don't give it to me anymore. They know that. But anyway, I'm teaching them taste.
I've got every book I've ever read. I've got tens of thousands of books. There are room after room after room after room, building after building full of books. I'll buy a book for you, but I won't lend it to you because you won't bloody well give it back. And so I walk through my books, and I don't have to read them again. I absorb them by osmosis. Because you know them all. You know the covers of the colours of the spines.
Gerald Murnane wrote a wonderful piece about a man who didn't want to read the books, but he just stood in front of the books and looked at the spine and just felt that he was just getting it all in by osmosis.
I think sometimes I think of making them into tea or smoking them, but you've got to keep your books. The books in your life are like the sleepers on the Nullarbor, They take that wonderful journey the books have given us. But you mentioned B. Campbell in the intro. B. Campbell is a regular on the program, and she comes from Newcastle upon Tyne, and she calls books books. And I think that's what they should be called, because it emphasises the two O's, and those remind you of the two I's that are required to read them. And to me, and to Ramona, I'm sure, and to most of you here, by definition, nothing has made a greater contribution to our lives than books. My own education, books. And therefore, I love all authors because they go to the trouble of writing the damn things.
Just to wrap up, both of you, I can't believe the output you have, the energy, and I'm just wondering what keeps you going, Philip, and
Drugs.
what keeps you going? And what keeps you going, Ramona? I can't believe you could put out 4 or 5 shows, four shows a week.
Because I'm a great self-improver. And I think that, the more I know, the better it'll be.
And you've got grandparental responsibilities
I've
now,
got
haven't you?
duties now.
And what
None
keeps
of my
you driving
daughters
every week back into the city?
Yeah, but you see, it makes that long drive, it makes it very pleasant. The phone doesn't ring. No one talks to me, I don't have to interview anyone. I can just listen, be bathed in other people's words. I've got to tell you, this must not leave this room. Ramona told me something before. She applied to get an iBook from the ABC, and they said, what has that possibly got to do with your job? That's the ABC we know and love.
It's true.
As this will be broadcast on the ABC,
That's
it'll
all
go
right.
straight to the
Hi,
top.
Mark.
Am I bothered?
Well, thank you very much, Philip and Ramona. I know this is a big Radio National audience here tonight, so they'll all be going home tonight and tomorrow and listening. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Well done. That's good. Thank you very much. Well done.